The notice went up on the Sessions Oak an hour before sundown, when the light came slantwise and gold across the common, and turned even the gorse to something worth painting. The steward's man drove all 4 nails himself, one at each corner of the paper, as though it might otherwise take fright and fly off to confess somewhere honest. The tenants of Ashfield came down from their cottages to read it, and those who could not read stood at the shoulders of those who could, and the words passed back through the little crowd the way cold water passes down a line of hands at a fire, quick, and leaving everyone colder than before. By order of the commissioners, the paper said, the waste and common ground of the manor of Ashfield, being surveyed and found, was to be enclosed and allotted. There followed a boundary described in poles and perches, and a map, and at the foot of it a line of fine copperplate that named the surveyor, whose measurements had made the whole thing lawful and true. Miss Honora Fenwick stood at the edge of the crowd where the hedge threw its long shadow, and she did not need to press forward to read the paper, because she had walked every foot of the ground it pretended to describe, and she knew before ever she saw the map that the line was wrong. She held a small book against her chest, a thing of scuffed leather and foxed pages, bound once and rebound twice, and her fingers pressed it a little harder as the words came back to her through the crowd. She said nothing. That was the first thing everyone noticed about her, and the last thing any of them thought to wonder at, that she said nothing. A woman who measured land for her bread learned early that the chain speaks for itself, or it does not speak at all. She looked at the gold light lying along the common, at the grey mere stone by the ford that had stood there longer than the manor had borne its name, and she thought, in the plain and stubborn way she thought about everything, that a chain has 100 links, and not one of them lies. The paper on the oak lied. She would only have to prove it, and to prove it she would have to be believed, which, being a woman with a bonnet full of pins and a book full of numbers no gentleman had ever asked to see, was the one thing in all her careful life she had never yet been. A man near the front read the boundary aloud for those who could not, his finger moving under the copperplate, and where his finger stopped the crowd made a small sound, not quite a word, the sound a body makes when a blow lands somewhere it cannot guard. The wheelwright, whose cow had grazed the western strip since before he was married, asked twice whether it truly meant the low pasture, and was told twice that it did, and then said nothing more, because there was nothing more that saying would mend. Behind him the sedge-cutters stood with their caps in their hands, as though at a graveside, which, in a manner of speaking, they were, for a thing that had fed their fires and their tables through more winters than any of them had counted, was being buried under 4 nails and a signature while they watched. Honora watched them more than she watched the paper. For the paper she already knew. She knew the faces, to every one, the way she knew the ground. She had drawn the lines that fed them, and she had sat at their firesides, settling their small disputes. And she understood, standing in the hedge shadow with the field book against her, that the wrong on the oak was not an abstraction of poles and perches, but a subtraction from each of these particular lives. So many geese, so much turf, so many autumns of pigmast under the Sessions oaks, all of it struck through with a ruler by a hand that had never once walked the ground it ruled upon. She did not weep, and she did not cry out. She had learned in a life of being overlooked that the overlooked have one advantage and one only, which is that no one troubles to watch what they do. and she meant, for once, to make that advantage count. She looked a last time at the grey mere stone by the ford, small and patient in the gold light, and she turned and walked home in the dusk, with the whole shape of the wrong already laid out in her mind like a survey waiting to be drawn. Honora Fenwick had learned to measure the world before she had learned to doubt it. Her father was Josiah Fenwick, a spare, weathered man with a surveyor's chain over one shoulder and spectacles pushed into his grey hair, and for the better part of 40 years he had drawn every honest line on the Ashfield estate. The field boundaries, the drainage, the timber lots, the wandering course of the brook that the maps always got wrong, because the brook would not hold still to be got right. He had no apprentice but the one at his elbow, and so the one at his elbow learned. By the time she could reach the head of the staff, she could read a chain to the link. By the time she could set a circumferentor level, she could keep a field book so clean that her father, who praised almost nothing, would sometimes turn a page and grow very quiet, which from him was the same as a shout. Measure twice, he used to tell her, on the cold mornings when the dew stood on the grass and the low sun laid every ridge and hollow bare. Measure twice, and set it down, and then the land can never be argued out from under a man by anyone with a smoother tongue than yours. She had thought it only good sense. She had not understood then that he was handing her a weapon, and that he had spent his whole life polishing it against the day someone would need it. She had one memory of him she kept above the others, the way one keeps the truest bearing of a survey to check all the others against. She had been new to the work, and cold and cross at being made to rerun a line she was certain of, and she had said so, and her father had crouched down beside her in the wet grass, and had not scolded her, which was worse than scolding. He had only asked her whether she would sign her name under a thing she had measured once, and not troubled to prove. She had not understood the question then. She understood it now. To sign a measurement was to stand behind it against all comers, against the smooth-tongued and the powerful and the merely mistaken. And a thing signed and unproven was a promise a person had no right to make. So they had rerun the line, and it had come out a link and a half from her first careless reading, a link and a half that in another place and another cause might have been the difference between a household's roof and a household's ruin, and she had never forgotten it, and she had never again resented the second measuring. The field book was the sum of 40 years of such second measurings, and to a stranger's eye it would have looked like nothing. A fat little volume of scuffed leather, its pages a thicket of figures and cramped abbreviations and small, careful sketches, the older leaves in her father's square hand, and the newer in her own rounder one, the two hands meeting somewhere in the middle years where she had begun to take the pen while he read the chain. But it was not nothing. It was the estate made legible, every boundary and bearing and buried mark that made Ashfield a place with edges, rather than a rumour with a name, and Honora kept it as some keep a family Bible, which in a way it was, for the births and deaths it recorded were the births and deaths of the truth about the land, and there was no other copy of it anywhere under heaven. The common was the heart of it, the way the common is always the heart of a place like Ashfield. It ran from the ford up the shallow rise to the ring of old oaks the parish called the Sessions, and out along the wet ground where the sedge grew, better part of 200 acres of rough grazing and turf and gorse that belonged, in the old and stubborn way of such things, to no one and to everyone. The tenants had their rights upon it, rights so old they were written nowhere but in the doing of them, year upon year, until the doing became a kind of law. The right to graze a cow or a string of geese, the right to cut turf for the winter fire, the right to gather the fallen wood and to run pigs under the oaks in the autumn when the mast came down. Poor rights, a fine gentleman would have called them, hardly worth the name of property. But they were the difference, for a good many families, between a hard life and no life at all, and everyone at Ashfield knew it, and had always known it, until a paper on an oak tree announced that they were to know it no longer. Josiah Fenwick had walked the bounds of that common more times than either of them could count. Every 7 years, the parish beat its bounds in the old way, the whole procession of them, the parson and the churchwardens and the tenants and the surveyor, tracing the line stone by stone so that those coming after would carry it in their memories when the old were gone. And every 7 years Josiah wrote it down again, fresh, in the field book. The bearing from the ford to the grey mere stone, the bearing from the mere stone to the leaning thorn, the number of chains and links along each run, the offsets to the brook and the boundary bank, until the common lay in the pages of the book as exact and as unarguable as it lay under the sky. He had done it so many times that the last time, his hands shaking a little by then, he had let Honora do the reading, and only checked her figures, and every one of her figures had been right. The beating of the bounds was the nearest thing the parish had to a rite, older than the church that blessed it, and Honora had walked it at her father's side more times than she could name. They would set out from the ford after the morning service, the whole straggling procession of them, and go the old way about the common from mark to mark, and at each mark they would stop, and the parson would read, and the marks would be pointed out and named aloud, so that memory might carry what paper could not. There was the grey mere stone at the ford, the anchor of it all, with the old estate mark cut into its weathered face. There was the leaning thorn a good half-mile on, bent all one way by the wind off the sedge. There was the ring of the Sessions oaks on the high ground, where in a rougher age the manor court had sat in the open air, and where the pigs still ran in the autumn for the mast. Between the marks the line ran straight and true across ground that gave no other sign of it, which was precisely why the marks mattered so. For a boundary you cannot see is a boundary someone will one day be tempted to move. Her father had taught her the line the way he taught her everything, by making her prove it. He would set her at the mere stone with the needle, and have her raise the far mark for herself, and then he would check her, and he was never satisfied with once. A boundary, he told her, is a promise the living make to those before and those after, that the edges of a man's world will be where they have always been, and not where the strongest neighbor would like them to be. And the surveyor is the keeper of that promise, which is a graver trust than most who wear finer coats will ever hold. She had taken the trust as gravely as it was given. She had not known, walking those wind-scoured Sundays, how soon the promise would be broken, nor that she alone would be left to keep it. He had been dead 2 winters now. He had left her the chain, the circumferentor in its scarred mahogany case, the plane table, the offset staff, and the field book, which was worth more than all the rest together, and which not one person in the county but Honora knew existed. He had left her to the trade, or as much of the trade as a woman was permitted to hold, which was to say the doing of it without the name of it. Farmers still sent for her quietly to settle a disputed hedge or lay out a drain, and paid her quietly, and spoke of the work afterward, as though it had somehow done itself. She did not mind. She had never worked for the credit. She had worked because a line drawn true was a small piece of justice made solid, and there was a deep and private satisfaction in that which the credit could only have spoiled. So she lived in the narrow house at the edge of the green, alone but for a woman who came to do the heavy wash, and she kept her father's instruments oiled and true, and she kept the field book on the shelf above the hearth, where the fire would keep the damp from it, and she went on measuring the small honest lines of other people's lives. And she watched, that spring, as the great house woke up. Ashfield had not had a resident master in years. The old Duke had died abroad, and the estate had run on through stewards and agents and the slow patient turning of the seasons, until word came in the early part of the year that the new Duke meant to take up residence at last and set the whole place to rights. Julian, the Duke of Ellesmere, was a name and not yet a face to the people of Ashfield, and names are easy to hope in. They said he was clever. They said he was cold. They said he had spent the war years managing far greater matters than a country estate, and had come home meaning to manage this one with the same hard efficiency, and that at least proved true. He arrived in April with 2 carriages and a valet and a great many crates of books, and he was, the housemaids reported to the village within the day, tall and dark-haired in his black tailcoat, with a severe jaw and cool slate-blue eyes that seemed to take the measure of a room and find it slightly wanting. He walked his fields. He read his rent rolls. He asked hard questions and did not care to be given soft answers, and the whole slow, sleepy machinery of the estate, which had grown comfortable in its long neglect, shuddered and began, reluctantly, to move. At the center of that machinery stood Mr. Silas Croft, the steward, a florid, heavy-set man with a ledger forever under his arm, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Croft had run Ashfield in all but name for a dozen years, and he had run it, as such men do, chiefly for the benefit of Mr. Silas Croft. The absent Duke had never troubled to look closely, and Croft had grown rich in the shadow of that inattention, in the small skimmings and the quiet arrangements, and the friends who somehow always won the good leases. He had watched the new Duke arrive with the particular dread of a man who has left a great deal lying about, that he would rather no one examined by daylight, and he had understood at once that his safety lay in making himself indispensable before the daylight reached him. He had understood, too, that a Duke who loved efficiency could be led by the nose, if only one dressed one's own advantage up in the language of improvement. The common was the prize. Croft had wanted it for years. 200 acres of rough ground, doing nothing, to his eye, but keeping a rabble of tenants in the illusion that they had something to lose. 200 acres that, drained and divided and enclosed, would carry 3 times the rent, and could be laid out in tidy allotments, of which the largest and best, by an arrangement no one need look at too closely, would find their way into the hands of Mr. Croft and a cousin of Mr. Croft's who dealt in land. All that stood between Silas Croft and that comfortable future was the awkward, ancient fact of where the boundary ran, and the still more awkward fact that if the common were fairly surveyed and fairly allotted, the tenant's old rights would have to be reckoned into it, and the reckoning would swallow most of the profit. What Croft required was not an enclosure. It was an enclosure on his own terms, on a line of his own drawing, with the tenant's rights measured small and the Duke's new revenue measured large, and the whole of it wrapped in enough surveyor's Latin that a busy man would sign it and move on. He had thought it out carefully, over the slow years of the old Duke's absence, the way a patient man thinks out a theft he means to have called improvement. The cousin in the county town, who dealt in land and asked no awkward questions, would take the best of the enclosed allotments off the estate's hands at a fair-seeming figure and sell them on at leisure, and the difference, less what was needed to keep Mr. Peel obliging, would come quietly home to Silas Croft by paths no ledger showed. It was not even, to his mind, quite dishonest. The tenants made nothing of the common but a bare living and a great deal of trouble. Drained and divided, the same ground would make money. And money was the only measure of a thing that Croft respected, that the living it took away was the whole of some household's living, and that the money it made would flow to men who had never set a boot on the ground, were considerations that did not weigh with him, because he had long ago stopped seeing the tenants as anything but an obstacle wearing clogs. His single difficulty was the boundary, and he had solved it with the boldness that had carried him through a dozen smaller frauds. He had simply had the line drawn where he wanted it, and the paper made handsome enough to carry the eye past the question. Let the survey be questioned, and it was Peel's word, a licensed man's, against a rabble who could prove nothing, and a dead surveyor who could say nothing. He had reckoned every risk he could see, and the reckoning had come out safe, and it was safe, entirely safe, but for the one thing outside his knowledge, which is the one thing such men can never reckon, because a lie can only account for the world it knows about, and Silas Croft did not know about the book. He laid it before the Duke on a wet morning in the estate office, a room Honora had been in exactly once in her life, to deliver a plan of a drainage cut her father had made. Croft had a map. It was a handsome map, drawn on good paper in a good hand, the common shown neat and shaded, the proposed enclosure ruled across it in a firm, confident line, and along the bottom, in copperplate, the attestation of the surveyor who had made it, one Mr. Peel of the county town, a man who would attest to a great many things for a great many reasons. The line on that map did not run where the true boundary ran. It ran a full chain inside it, all along the western side, so that a strip of ground 22 yards wide and near a mile long, the best of the grazing, the driest and the highest, was quietly transferred from the common to the Duke's private demesne, from which it could then be sold. 66 feet. It does not sound like much. Along a mile of boundary it is a theft you could drive a herd through, and Croft had drawn it with a steady hand. The Duke bent over the map. He asked good questions, which was the danger and the beauty of him. He asked whether the tenants' rights had been valued and compensated, and Croft said, smoothly, that they had, that the sums were entered in the schedule, modest sums, for the rights themselves were modest, and their proofs, alas, were poor, being nowhere written down. He asked whether the boundary was certain, and Croft said it had been surveyed afresh by Mr. Peel and found to run just here, and here he laid his heavy finger on the false line, and the Duke looked at the firm copperplate, and the confident line, and the neat schedule, and he did what busy, clever men do with a well-made lie. He believed the paper. He signed where Croft showed him to sign, and the machinery turned, and the commissioners were engaged. And in the fullness of the law's slow time the notice went up on the Sessions Oak in the gold light of an evening in autumn, and the common of Ashfield, or the best of it, ceased to belong to the people who had always belonged to it. Honora heard of the enclosure before she saw the notice, the way one hears of a death in a small place, in lowered voices and half-sentences. She went up to the Oak in the evening to read it for herself, because she never trusted a thing she had only been told, and she stood at the edge of the crowd with the field book against her chest, and she read the boundary in poles and perches, and she felt the wrongness of it go through her like cold water, before her mind had even finished the arithmetic. She knew this ground, she had it by heart, and she had it on paper, and the line on the notice was not the line that ran under her feet. It was inside it. It had been moved deliberately and precisely by very close to a chain, and someone had signed a false measurement in a fair hand and called it true. She could have spoken then. She thought about it, standing in the dusk, while the tenants drifted away in their ones and twos with the particular silence of people who have just been robbed by a document. She thought about walking up to the great house and asking to see the Duke and laying the field book open on his desk. And she knew, with the weary clarity of a woman who had been overlooked her whole life, exactly how it would go. She would be a spinster with a book of scribbles claiming to know the land better than a licensed surveyor and a signed award and a duke's own steward. She would be humored, if she were lucky, and shown out. And Croft would learn that she had the book, and the book, which was the only proof in the world that the true line existed, would be a very easy thing to make disappear. Along, perhaps, with the awkward woman who kept it. So she said nothing. She went home, and she banked the fire, and she took the field book down from its shelf, and read by candlelight the pages her father's hand and her own had filled, the bearing from the ford to the grey mere stone, the chains and links of the western run, the offsets to the bank, all of it exact, all of it patient, all of it waiting. And she understood that her father had been right about the weapon, and that the day he had polished it against had come, and that the only question left was whether she had the nerve and the cunning to use it, being what she was, against what they were. She decided to make certain first. That was her way. It was the only way she trusted. A grievance was only a feeling, and feelings could be argued away, but a measurement, taken twice and set down, could not. So in the grey before dawn on the next fair morning, before the estate was awake and while the new fence posts stood raw and pale along the false line like a row of accusations, Honora Fenwick took her father's chain and his circumferentor and his offset staff, and she went out onto the common to measure the theft. It was slow, careful, lonely work, and she loved it the way she loved all such work, for the way it emptied her of everything but the ground and the numbers. She set her first station at the ford, at the grey mere stone, which was where the true boundary had always begun. A squat, weathered block of stone half sunk in the turf, with the old estate mark cut into its face. A mark her father had shown her 100 times, worn now almost smooth but still there under the fingers if you knew where to feel. From the mere stone she took her bearing north by the needle, and the needle swung and steadied and pointed true, the way it always did, indifferent to stewards and dukes and awards, and she read the angle and set it down. Then she laid out the chain along the line the mere stone gave her, link by link, station by station, up the western edge of the common, and every few chains she took an offset to the new fence posts and wrote down the distance between the true line and the false one. The distance did not vary. That was what told her it was no honest error. An honest error wanders, a lie holds its line. At the ford the new fence stood 22 yards inside the mere stone. A quarter mile up, 22 yards. At the leaning thorn, 22 yards. Chain after chain, the false fence held its steady greedy 66 feet inside the truth, as though someone had taken the true survey and simply added a chain's width to the Duke's side all the way along, which, she understood, was precisely what someone had done. It was not a mistake. It was arithmetic performed by a thief. And the beauty of it, the terrible confident beauty of it, was that it was invisible to anyone who did not already know where the true line ran. Because the ground itself gave no sign, the false fence looked as settled and lawful as any fence in England. She worked until the sun was well up, and the first cart rattled on the distant lane, and then she packed the instruments and went home and set it all down in the field book, on a fresh page facing the old survey, the false line beside the true, so that the theft lay bare in her own neat hand, and she sat and looked at it a long while. She had her proof now, as sure as measurement could make it. What she did not have, and could not see how to get, was a single person in the world with the power to right the wrong, who would consent to take the word of Honora Fenwick over the word of the paper on the oak. The estate went on around her, indifferent and busy. The strip of stolen grazing was staked, and the surveyor's flags fluttered along it, and the talk in the village turned from anger to the duller, heavier thing that comes after anger in poor places, which is endurance. Mrs. Comber felt it first and worst. Mrs. Comber was a stooped widow in a turf-stained apron, who had kept geese on the common for 30 years, and the geese were the better part of what kept her. The eggs, and the down, and the birds themselves at Michaelmas. And the strip they were now forbidden was the very ground her geese had always grazed, the wet green margin by the brook. She came to Honora's door one evening, not knowing quite why she came, only that Honora's father had always been a fair man, and folks still went to that house when the world had gone wrong, and she stood on the step twisting her apron, and said that she supposed there was nothing to be done, and looked at Honora as if hoping to be contradicted. She was not the only one, of course. The enclosure of the western strip fell hardest on those with least, as such things always do, for the strip was the poor ground, the wet green margin, and the rough grazing that the substantial farmers had never much wanted, and the cottagers could not do without. There was the sedge cutter, whose winter fuel had come off that ground for 30 years, and who now must buy coal he could not afford or sit cold. There was the widow's neighbour, a bent man with a bad chest, who had run 3 pigs under the oaks each autumn, and fattened them en masse, that cost him nothing, and who would keep no pigs this year. The loss ran through the village like damp through a wall, not sudden, only steady and cold and everywhere, and it changed the place. Folk who had nodded to craftsman on the lane now looked through him. A silence grew up around the great house, the particular silence of those who have learned that speaking does no good and may do harm, and beneath the silence a slow banked anger that had nowhere to go and so turned inward into the grey endurance of the poor. Honora felt that silence settle over the whole of Ashfield, and she felt her own part in it as a kind of accusation. She had the one thing that might break it, there on the shelf above her hearth, and every day she did not use it was a day the sedge cutter sat cold, and the bent man's sty stood empty, and Mrs. Comber's geese fretted against a fence that had no right to be there. She told herself again that she was waiting for the moment and the means, and it was true, and it was also, she knew, not the whole truth, for underneath the prudence there was fear, the plain animal fear of a woman who had been overlooked her whole life and knew exactly how little the world would spend to defend her if she stepped out of the shadow and was struck at. She sat with that fear on the long evenings, and she did not let it win, but she did not pretend it was not there. Courage, her father had said once, is not the absence of the tremor in the hand. It is setting the instrument down level in spite of it. Honora did not contradict her. She could not yet, in honesty, promise anything. But she gave the old woman tea and let her talk. And she listened, and somewhere in the listening, a hard, small resolve that had been forming in her for days set at last like mortar. She had told herself she was gathering proof and waiting for her moment out of prudence, and that was true. But sitting across from Mrs. Comber's chapped hands and frightened, dignified face, she understood that prudence could tip over into cowardice if she let it, that a proof kept safe in a book on a shelf helped no one, and that her father had not taught her to measure true so that she could keep the truth tidy while the widow's geese starved. When Mrs. Comber had gone, Honora took down the field book and looked at the 2 lines on the facing page. And she said aloud, to the empty room and to her father in it, that she would find a way to make them look. She did not yet know it would be the Duke himself who gave her the way. She met him first by accident, on the high ground above the ford, on a bright, hard morning, perhaps a fortnight after the notice went up. She had gone out to check a bearing, unable to leave the thing alone, and she was crouched at the grey mere stone with the circumferentor on its staff when she heard a horse and looked up to find the Duke of Ellesmere reining, in not 20 feet away, tall and dark-haired in his black tailcoat, with a severe jaw and cool slate-blue eyes that were fixed on her with the particular displeasure of a man who has found a stranger doing something incomprehensible on his land. What, he asked, was she about? She might have curtsied and stammered and fled, as he plainly expected. She did not. She was too deep in the work, and the work made her forget to be afraid, which was perhaps the truest thing about her. She rose, and she told him plainly that she was taking a bearing. He looked at the instrument, and at the chain coiled at her feet, and at her ink-stained fingers, and something crossed his face, surprise, and under it a flicker of curiosity he was too proud to show. A woman with a surveyor's tools was a thing he had never seen, and the Duke of Ellesmere, whatever his coldness, had a mind that could not leave a novelty unexamined. He asked her whether she knew what the instrument was for. She answered that she did, that it measured horizontal angles, and that this one was a circumferentor and read by needle rather than by vernier, and that it wanted its bubble truer than it was, and she was about to true it. And she bent and trued it, while he sat his horse and watched, and the silence changed its quality. From suspicion toward something warier and more interested, he put another question, and then another, in the clipped way of a man accustomed to examining stewards and factors, and each time she answered him plainly and exactly and not a word beyond what was asked, and he found to his faint annoyance that he could not catch her out. He asked what a chain was, thinking to expose the limit of a village pretender's knowledge, and she told him 22 yards 100 links, and that 10 square chains made an acre, and that the whole of England had been reckoned in those links since before either of their grandfathers drew breath. He asked, more sharply, whether a woman had any business with such work, and she looked at him levelly, and said that the ground did not appear to mind who measured it, so long as it was measured true, and that her figures had never yet come out womanish or mannish, but only right or wrong, and that she had troubled to make them right. It was not insolent quite, it was merely accurate, and accuracy from a quarter he had thought beneath his notice was a novelty the Duke of Ellesmere did not know how to file, and so he sat his horse a moment longer than he meant to, looking at her. There was a thing in her stillness that snagged him, though he would not have owned it then. He was a man much flattered and little told the truth, and he had grown, without knowing it, starved for the plain thing plainly said, and here, on his own high ground, was a plain woman saying plain things and asking nothing of him. Not his favor, not his admiration, not even his leave, only measuring his land under his nose as though the land's truth were a matter above his rank and hers alike. It unsettled him and it drew him, both at once, and he rode away faster than he had come, and told himself he had merely been amused, and was too honest, even in the privacy of his own skull, to be quite convinced of it. He did not, of course, ask her about the boundary. Why should he? To him she was a curiosity on a morning ride, a plain woman with a man's tools, worth a moment's amusement and no more. And after a few more questions, put in the tone of a man testing whether a trick is real, he touched his hat with the faint irony of the great to the small and rode on. But he remembered her. She saw that he remembered her, in the small backward glance he did not quite suppress, and she filed the meeting away, as she filed everything away, and thought that a man who could not leave a novelty alone might, if the novelty were baited carefully enough, be led to look at a map. She did not yet see how. But she had felt, under his coldness, the working of a real and hungry intelligence, and she understood that such a mind was the one kind that might, against every expectation, be made to prefer a hard truth to a comfortable lie. It was a thin thread to hang a hope on. It was the only thread she had, and she began patiently to spin it stronger. So she waited, and she watched, and she made herself useful in the small invisible ways that had always been her cover and her craft. When a tenant's ditch was in dispute, she measured it, as ever, and said nothing of the greater matter. When she passed the works on the western strip, she noted, without appearing to note, how the fence went up, and where the flag stood, and how far along the drainage had come, storing each detail in the same orderly part of her mind where she kept her bearings. She was, she knew, gathering a second kind of survey, not of the land but of the wrong that had been done to it, and of the men who had done it, and of the one narrow path by which the wrong might yet be undone, and she laid that survey out as patiently and as exactly as any she had ever made on the ground, because she had learned from her father that the work done before anyone is watching, is the work that decides whether the watched work succeeds. She did not know how long she might have to wait. She was prepared, if it came to it, to wait years, to let the enclosure settle and the guard drop, and some later opening present itself, for she was patient the way stone is patient, and she trusted that a truth kept safe would keep. What she had not reckoned on, because she was too modest to reckon on it, was that the very quality she had gambled might one day open a door had already begun quietly to open it, and that the door would open from the inside, pushed by the restless conscience of the one man on the estate proud enough to have signed the wrong and honest enough to be unable to leave it alone. The way opened as such ways do, from the least expected quarter, and it opened because the Duke was, whatever else, a thorough man. He had signed the enclosure at a glance, trusting Croft, but a thorough man's trust is a restless thing, and as the works went forward and the costs mounted, and the tenant's silence took on a texture he did not like, he found himself, one evening in the estate office, going back over the papers he had signed. Not because he suspected anything, but because it was his habit to know exactly what he had agreed to. He spread out the award and the map and the schedule of compensations, and he read them with the same hard attention he gave to everything, and two small things snagged on that attention like wool on a nail. The first was the schedule. The sums set against the tenant's rights were very small. Smaller, he thought, than even poor rights should fairly come to, and he was enough of a landlord to know that rights held time out of mind are not nothing, whatever a steward eager to be rid of them might say. The second thing was the copperplate name at the foot of the map. Not Peel. Peel meant nothing to him. It was a phrase Croft had used, in passing, to lend the survey weight, that the boundary had been established in accordance with the old survey of the estate, the authoritative one, the one everybody trusted, made years ago by the late estate surveyor, a Mr. Fenwick, whose work was a byword in the county for exactness. Croft had meant it only as a flourish, a bit of borrowed authority to reassure a signing hand. But the Duke, being thorough, made a note to see this famous old survey for himself, since his whole enclosure now rested upon it, and the next morning he asked Croft to produce it. Croft could not produce it. Croft had never had it, no one had it but Honora, though Croft did not know that, and Croft did what cornered men do and improvised, saying the old survey was lost, or worn out, or perhaps never committed fully to paper, but that its findings were well known, and Mr. Peel had worked from them faithfully. It was a poor answer, and the Duke, who had spent years listening to poor answers from clever men, heard the poorness in it. He did not accuse. He simply grew quiet and thoughtful, and asked, as if idly, whether this Mr. Fenwick might be consulted directly, for he found he would rather hear the thing from the surveyor's own mouth than from a copy of a copy. And Croft, sweating now, said that Mr. Fenwick was dead these 2 years, which was the one true thing he had said all morning, and which he plainly hoped would close the matter. It did not close the matter. It opened it. For the housekeeper, Mrs. Ashe, who was pouring the Duke's coffee, and who had lived at Ashfield her whole life, and disliked Silas Croft with the clean, patient hatred of a decent servant for a dishonest master, said quietly, in the way servants say the things that change everything, that Mr. Fenwick was indeed gone, God rest him, but that his skill had not died with him, for he had trained the one who kept his instruments and his books still, and folk about the estate went to that house yet when they had a line to settle, and had never once been sent away wrong. The Duke asked who this was. Mrs. Ash said it was Miss Fenwick, down at the narrow house by the green. And the Duke remembered, with a small cold shock of recognition, the plain, composed woman on the high ground truing her instrument with her ink-stained fingers, the woman he had ridden past and half forgotten, and he understood all at once that the person who might know the truth of his boundary was the one person on the whole estate whom no one, himself included, had thought to ask. He rode down to the green that same afternoon. Honora, looking up from the table where the field book lay open, saw the Duke of Ellesmere at her own low door, tall and dark-haired in his black tailcoat, with a severe jaw and cool slate-blue eyes, stooping to come in under the lintel, and she knew before he spoke that the thread had held, that the mind she had gambled on had followed the wool to the nail, and that the moment she had prepared for and dreaded had arrived on its own 2 feet, without her having to lift a finger to fetch it. She rose, and she was very calm the way she was calm at the instrument, and she did not reach for the book, and she did not curtsy any lower than dignity required, and she waited to hear what a duke would ask of a woman he had ridden past and thought a curiosity. He asked without preamble, for he was not a man who wasted words, whether it was true that she had learned surveying from her father. She said it was. He asked whether her father had surveyed the common. She said her father had surveyed the common 12 times over 40 years, and that she had surveyed it with him and after him. He asked, and here his voice changed, the coldness thinning to reveal the sharp attention beneath, whether she knew where the true boundary of the common ran. And Honora Fenwick looked at the Duke of Ellesmere across her father's table, and understood that everything turned on how she answered, and that she must not overreach, and must not cringe, but must be exactly and only what she was, which was a woman who knew. She said that she did know. She said she could show him, not in words, which any liar could produce, but in figures taken on the ground and set down at the time, and in stones that were still in the earth where her father had recorded them, and that if his measurements and the paper on the oak disagreed, he might dig at the ford and see for himself which of them the ground preferred. And she turned the field book toward him on the table, open at the facing pages, the true line and the false, and she watched the Duke of Ellesmere look down at a woman's neat columns of chains and links and bearings, and she watched the exact instant, which she would remember for the rest of her life, when the amusement went out of his face and something else came into it, something that was not yet respect, but was the ground that respect grows in, which is the sudden, humbling suspicion that one has been wrong about a person, and wrong about a great deal else besides. He did not take her word. She had not expected him to, and she would have thought less of him if he had, for a man who took a stranger's word against his own signed award was only a different kind of fool from the man who signed it. What he did was harder and better. He looked at the 2 lines, and he asked her to explain them, and he listened, actually listened, while she did. She showed him how the survey was built, station by station, each bearing and distance keyed to the last, so that the whole was a chain of reasoning in which no single link could be moved without breaking all the rest, which was precisely why a lie could only be added on top of the truth, never woven into it. She showed him the offsets to the mere stone at the ford, the grey stone with the old estate mark, and told him it was still there, still in the ground, and that the false fence stood a measured chain inside it. She spoke of it all in the flat, exact, unpleading voice of someone reporting the tide, and it was that voice, more than any argument, that reached him, because he had spent his life among people who pleaded and flattered and shaded the truth to his liking. And here was a woman who simply told him what was so, and left him to make of it what he would. He asked her at one point a shrewd question, the question of a man who has begun to see the shape of a thing and is testing whether it will hold. If the line had been moved, why had no one seen it? Why had the tenants themselves not cried out that the fence stood in the wrong place? And Honora gave him the answer that was the whole cruelty of it. Because the ground gives no sign, she said. A fence, a chain inside the true line, looks exactly as lawful as a fence upon it. There is no crook in it, no gap, nothing the eye can seize on. Only the marks know where the line truly runs, and the marks are a stone half sunk in the turf that no one but a surveyor thinks to read, and another that no one alive but she knew was there at all. The tenants felt the theft in their empty pastures, she said, but a feeling is not a proof, and they had no more means of proving where the line should run than of proving where last year's wind had blown. That was why such thefts were safe, she said. That was why they were done. A man who would never dare to take a purse in the open will move a boundary without a qualm, because a boundary, once moved and papered, defends itself. The Duke was quiet at that, and Honora saw the words go into him and settle, and saw him understand, perhaps for the first time in his well-defended life, how much of what he had always taken for the settled order of the world was in truth only the order that had gone unchallenged, because the challenging of it had been left to people too poor and too plain to be heard. He looked at her then not as a curiosity, and not quite yet as an equal, but as one looks at a person who has just enlarged the world by a room one did not know the house contained. And he asked her, in a different voice from any he had used yet, to go on. When she had done, the Duke was silent a long moment. Then he asked the question that showed her he had understood everything, the dangerous, essential question. If this was so, he said, then his own steward had laid a false survey before him and procured his signature to a theft, and that was not an error but a crime, and she was accusing Silas Croft of it, on the strength of a book that she alone had kept and that no other soul could vouch for. Was she prepared to have that book examined, challenged, called a forgery, made in the last fortnight by a bitter woman for spite? Was she prepared, in short, to be disbelieved by everyone who had a reason to disbelieve her, which was everyone with anything to lose? Honora said that she was. She said the book could be examined by any surveyor he cared to bring, that its pages were old and its ink was aged, and its earlier hand was her father's, which men still living could swear to, and that in any case she was not asking him to believe the book. She was asking him to test it. Bearings could be retaken. Chains could be rerun. And stones did not lie and could not be bribed. The mere stone at the ford was either where her book said, or it was not, and a spade would settle in an afternoon what a court might argue for a year. Bring your Mr. Peel, she said, and your steward, and dig at the ford in front of them, and let the ground be the witness. She was not afraid of the test. Only a false line feared the ground. It was, the Duke thought, looking at her composed and unafraid across the plain table, the single most confident thing anyone had said to him since he came to Ashfield, and the confidence of it was of a wholly different kind from Croft's. Croft was confident the way a card sharp is confident, in the smoothness of his own performance. This woman was confident the way a mathematician is confident, in something outside herself that she had merely troubled to read correctly. He had staked a great deal of his short reign at Ashfield on Croft's smoothness. He found, rather to his own surprise, that he would sooner stake it now on this woman's arithmetic, and the discovery unsettled him, for it meant admitting he had been played, and the Duke of Ellesmere did not enjoy admitting he had been played. But he was, above all, a man who preferred a hard truth to a comfortable lie, and Honora had wagered everything on that one quality in him, and she had wagered right. He told her he would put it to the test, and that he would do it openly, before witnesses, so that whatever the ground said could not afterward be whispered away. He would give Croft no warning of the reason, only summon them all to the ford on a stated morning, on the pretext of viewing the works, and there, before the steward and the surveyor Peel, and the churchwardens, and any tenant who cared to come, they would dig. If the mere stone lay where her book said, the award would fall, and the common would be restored, and the man who had cheated him would answer for it. If it did not, she would have made a very grave accusation on very thin ground, and he would not be able to protect her from the consequence. He asked whether she understood the whole of what she was risking. She said she had understood it for a fortnight, and had measured it, as she measured everything, and had found it worth the doing. And the Duke of Ellesmere, who had come to her door to consult a curiosity, went back up to the great house, having taken, without quite meaning to, the word of a quiet woman over the word of his own steward, and he was honest enough with himself, riding up the lane in the failing light, to know that it was not only the arithmetic that had persuaded him. The days before the appointed morning were long ones. Croft, who knew only that the Duke had grown cool and had summoned a viewing of the works, felt the ground shifting under him without being able to see how, and a man who has built his safety on a lie lives in perpetual dread of the one question he cannot answer. He tried, in those days, to find out what the Duke was about, and could not. The Duke had learned discretion in harder schools than Silas Croft's. He tried to reassure himself that the thing was done, signed, lawful, past unpicking, and could not quite manage it, for he had committed the one error that undoes such men, which is to believe that because no one had objected, no one knew. He did not know about the field book. He did not know that a plain woman by the green had measured his theft to the link and set it down. He slept badly, and he sharpened his story, and he told himself that if it came to it, it would be his word and Peel's and a signed award against nothing at all, which was true, except that he had forgotten the stones. Honora spent those days quietly, as she spent all her days. But underneath the quiet she was making ready with the thoroughness her father had taught her, for she meant to leave nothing to chance that measurement could secure. She went out once more, alone, and re-ran the critical line from the ford, not because she doubted it, but because she would rather find her own error in private than have another find it in public. And she found no error, because there was none. She oiled and trued the circumferentor. She copied out, in a fair, clean hand, the relevant pages of the survey, so that the figures could be read by anyone without handling the old book itself. And she went, the evening before, to Mrs. Comber's cottage, and told the old woman only that she should come to the ford in the morning and bring whoever else had grazed the western strip, for there was to be a viewing, and it concerned them nearly. Mrs. Comber looked at her a long moment with her frightened, dignified face, and asked, not quite daring to hope whether it might come right after all, and Honora, who never promised what she could not measure, said only that the ground would speak in the morning, and that she trusted the ground. That last night she did not sleep much, and did not try to. She sat up by the banked fire with the field book open on her knee, not reading it, for she knew every figure in it, but only holding it, the way one holds the hand of someone about to go into danger. Everything rested on it now, and on the buried stone, and on her own steadiness in the morning before the great and the doubtful. She thought of her father, a spare, weathered man with a surveyor's chain over one shoulder and spectacles pushed into his grey hair, and she thought that he had set that checkstone in the ground a spade deep, for no cause he could have named at the time, only the surveyor's plain habit of never trusting a single mark, and that his patient habit, kept up through 40 unremarkable years, was about to reach out of 2 winters' silence, and undo a crime he never lived to see. That was the whole of what he had tried to teach her, she thought, that the honest small thing done faithfully and set down is never wasted, that it lies in the ground of the world like his stone in the turf, waiting, and that its hour comes when the liars have quite forgotten it was ever there. She was not without fear. If the ground failed her in the morning, if some freak of memory or weather had shifted a certainty she had staked everything upon, she would be finished at Ashfield, a bitter spinster who had accused a duke's steward and been proved a fool, and no measurement of hers would ever again be trusted to settle so much as a garden hedge. She knew it, and she had weighed it, and she found, sitting in the last of the firelight, that she did not repent the risk. Some things were worth being ruined for, and a true line was one of them, and she would rather go down having made the ground speak than live on safe and silent while the widow's geese starved behind a lying fence. When the grey came at the window she rose, and washed, and dressed with care, and took up the book, and went out to meet the morning she had spent 2 winters, without knowing it, preparing for. The morning came fair and cold, with the same slantwise gold light lying along the common that had lit the notice on the oak, as though the season meant to bookend the wrong with the same beauty it had begun it with. They gathered at the ford by the grey mere stone, the Duke of Ellesmere, tall and dark-haired in his black tailcoat, with a severe jaw and cool slate-blue eyes, on foot now and grave, Silas Croft, a florid, heavy-set man with a ledger forever under his arm and a smile that never reached his eyes, though the smile was thin that morning and the eyes were watchful. The surveyor Peel, a narrow, anxious man who had begun to wish he had attested rather less firmly, the 2 churchwardens, the parson, and a scattering of tenants drawn by the mystery of it, Mrs. Comber among them in her turf, stained apron, keeping to the back, and Honora Fenwick, a slight woman with steady grey eyes and ink-stained fingers, her dark hair pinned beneath a plain straw bonnet, with the field book in her hands and the copied pages folded in her sleeve, standing a little apart, composed and waiting. The Duke did not waste the morning on ceremony. He said, to the puzzled little assembly, that a question had been raised concerning the true boundary of the common, and that he meant to settle it here and now in the plainest way there was, by finding the old boundary stone, and seeing where it lay in relation to the new fence, and that he had asked Miss Fenwick, who kept the late surveyor's records, to say where the stone should be found. He turned to Honora and asked her before them all to direct the digging. It was a small thing and an enormous one, that turning it was a duke, in front of his steward and his tenants, publicly handing the authority of the moment to a plain woman with a book, and Silas Croft watched it happen, with the first real fear moving in his florid face, because he understood, as the tenants did not yet, that the Duke did not do such a thing idly, and that the ground was about to be asked a question to which Croft very much did not want the answer. Honora stepped to the grey mere stone, the squat weathered block half sunk in the turf, with the old estate mark worn almost smooth on its face, and she laid her hand on it, and she said, in her flat exact voice, that this was the first witness, the anchor of the whole western boundary, marked as the estate's own and recorded by her father through 40 years. From this stone, she said, the true line ran north by the bearing in the book, and she read the bearing aloud, and she took the circumferentor and set it on the stone and let the needle swing and steady and point true, indifferent to them all, and the bearing matched. That was the first small silence. Then she said that if the line on the award were true, this anchor stone would stand upon it or near it, but that in truth the new fence ran a full chain to the east of where they stood, 66 feet, and that between this stone and that fence lay a mile-long strip of the common that had been taken by moving the line, and that she would prove the stone was the true anchor by uncovering the second witness, the buried mark her father had set one chain north as a check, which the makers of the false survey had never known was there, because it had been below the turf for 30 years, and appeared on no map but hers. That was the stroke that undid them, and she had kept it for last on purpose, the way her father had taught her to keep the surest proof in reserve. For an honest surveyor, setting a boundary he means to last, does not trust a single stone. He sets checks, marks below the ground at known distances, so that if the visible stone is moved or lost the line, can still be recovered by digging. Josiah Fenwick had set such a check one chain north of the mere stone. A flat marked stone buried a spade deep, and he had recorded it in the field book with its bearing and its distance, exactly one chain 100 links from the anchor. It had lain there undisturbed while the false survey was drawn over the top of it in ignorance, and it was the one thing in the world that Croft could not have accounted for, because he had not known it existed, because the only record of it was the book he did not know he had reason to fear. Honora measured the chain north along the true line, 100 links, pacing it out with the actual chain in her hands, so that all could see it was no trick of paper. And she stopped. And she said, "Dig here." They dug. The Duke's own men dug, in front of everyone, in the cold gold light, while Croft stood rigid, and Peel went the colour of tallow, and the tenants pressed closer without knowing yet what they were about to see. A spade's depth down, the iron struck stone. They cleared the turf and the earth away, and there it lay, a flat grey slab with a mark cut into it, the same estate mark as on the anchor stone. Exactly one chain from the mere stone, on the exact bearing the book had named. Precisely where a woman's 40-year-old figures said it would be, and precisely where the false line said there was nothing but the Duke's private ground. It could not have been faked. It had been in the earth longer than the quarrel, longer than the enclosure, longer than the Duke's residence. And it agreed to the link with the book Croft had wanted to call a forgery. The true boundary stood revealed, anchored at both ends in stone, that had been waiting patiently in the dark for someone to trouble to dig, and the false fence stood a full chain inside it, exposed for exactly what it was, which was a line drawn by a thief and signed by a fool and believed by everyone, because no one had thought to ask the ground. Mrs. Comber, at the back, pressed forward with the rest to see, and when she understood what the flat grey slab in the mud was saying, that the fence which had taken her geese run stood a whole chain inside the ground the estate's own mark had always claimed, she put her chapped hand to her mouth and made a small sound, and the sedge cutter beside her swore softly and reverently, as a man swears in church when the thing he had given up praying for arrives at last. For they saw it now, all of them, plainer than any award, plainer than any lawyer could have made it. Not a document to be taken on trust, or fought in a court they could not afford, but a stone in the earth, their stone, the estate's stone, lying exactly where a plain woman's book had promised it would lie, and exactly where the fine paper had sworn there was nothing. There was no arguing with it. A man may argue with a surveyor, and browbeat a witness, and outlast a poor man's purse in the law's long grinding, but no one has ever yet found a way to argue with a stone that has lain undisturbed in the ground since before the quarrel began. They looked from the stone to Honora then, the whole ragged half-circle of them, the tenants and the churchwardens and the parson, and the look was a thing she had never had turned on her in the whole of her overlooked life, and did not quite know how to bear. It was the look people give the one who has stood up, at cost to herself, for what they had all known was true, and none of them had been able to prove. She did not color or drop her eyes. She only laid her hand once more on the anchor stone at the ford, the grey mere stone with the old estate mark, worn almost smooth, as if to thank it, and waited for the Duke to do what she had gambled he would do. There was a silence at the ford then that Honora would remember all her life. The silence of a thing that cannot be argued becoming plain to a crowd of people who had believed the opposite an hour before. Then the Duke turned from the uncovered stone to Silas Croft, and his face was terrible in its quiet, and he asked the steward very softly to explain how the old boundary stone came to lie a full chain outside the boundary that Croft had sworn to him was true. And Croft, a florid, heavy-set man, with a ledger forever under his arm and a smile that never reached his eyes, found that the smile was quite gone, and that he had no explanation that was not a confession, and that the ground, which cannot be bribed or bullied or talked around, had told the one story he had built his whole scheme on the certainty that no one could tell. He tried, of course. Men like Croft always try. He blustered that the stone proved nothing, that boundaries shift, that the woman had somehow planted it, an accusation so absurd against a slab bedded in 30 years of undisturbed earth, that it died in the air as he spoke it. He turned on Peel, and Peel turned on him. each seeing his own safety now in the other's guilt. And between the two of them, in their panic, the shape of the thing came out plainly enough for any listener, that Croft had wanted the Western Strip, that he had had the survey drawn to a line of his own choosing, that the tenants' rights had been valued at nothing because their proofs were nowhere written, and that the whole of it had rested on the confident assumption that the old true survey was lost with the old surveyor, and that the awkward fact of the buried checkstone had been, quite simply, unknown to them, because the only person who knew it was the one person no one had thought worth asking. And the Duke listened to all of it with a cold and growing anger. Not least, Honora thought, an anger at himself, for he was a proud man, and he had signed the theft with his own hand, and a proud man forgives a great many things sooner than he forgives being made a party to a wrong he might have caught had he only troubled to ask the quiet woman at the edge of his own land. It was over, after that, though the law took its slow time to make the ending official. The award built upon the false survey could not stand once its foundation was shown to be a moved line, and the Duke, to his credit, did not drag his feet. For having been shown the truth, he was as thorough in righting the wrong as he had been in the wronging of it. The enclosure was set aside. The false fence came down along the western strip, post by raw post, and the common ran open again from the ford to the Sessions Oaks as it had run time out of mind, and Mrs. Comber's geese went back onto the wet green margin by the brook, and the old woman stood at the edge of the restored common one evening, with her chapped hands folded, and wept, quietly, in the way of people to whom a small, enormous thing has been given back. Croft was dismissed, and, in due course, answered to the law for what he had done, and Peel with him, and the county talked of it for a season, as the county will. But the talk that mattered least to Honora was the talk of Croft. What she noticed, in the weeks after the ford, was the change in the way the Duke of Ellesmere looked at her, and the slow, careful, altogether unexpected thing that grew out of it. For he came back to the narrow house by the green. He came, the first time, on the honest errand of setting matters right, to ask her formally to make a true survey of the whole common and its rights, properly recorded and properly compensated, so that what had nearly been stolen could never be stolen again, and to be paid for it openly and in her own name, which no one had ever thought to offer Josiah Fenwick's heir before. And she agreed, and she did the work, and it was the finest work of her life, the common laid out true and fair at last, every right reckoned and written down, and she did it with the Duke often at her side, for he found, he said, that he wished to understand the thing he had so nearly ruined, and asked her to teach him to read a chain and set a bearing, which she did. On the high ground above the ford in the gold evenings, the two of them bent over the instrument, while the needle pointed true. He was not a man who changed quickly, or said much of what he felt. That was not his nature, any more than pleading was hers. But Honora, who had spent her life reading the small, honest signs that people gave without meaning to, read the change in him plainly enough, in the way he sought her opinion now and waited for it, in the way the coldness had gone out of his slate-blue eyes when they turned to her, in the way a proud man who had learned he was capable of a great error had also learned, in the same hard lesson, to value above rubies the one person who had troubled to measure the truth and had had the courage to make him look at it. He told her once, on the high ground with the chain in his hands, and the light going gold across the restored common, that he had ridden past her that first morning and thought her a curiosity, and that it was the greatest misjudgment of his life, and that he had come to think there was no one on his whole estate, nor in his whole acquaintance, whose word he would sooner have than hers, because hers was the one word he had ever known that was built, link by link, out of nothing but what was so. And Honora, who did not blush easily, and did not blush then, felt something turn over quietly in her that she had long ago stopped expecting to feel, and understood that the slow, careful respect in the Duke's grave face had somewhere along the way become something warmer, and that it was, unlike the paper on the oak, entirely true. There was an evening, near the end of the great survey, that she kept afterward the way she kept the truest bearings. They had come to the last of the marks, the ring of the Sessions oaks on the high ground, and the light was going down gold across the whole restored common, the ford and the leaning thorn and the wet green margin where the geese were back, and the Duke had the chain in his hands, for she had taught him at last to run a line himself, clumsily and in earnest. He read the distance aloud to her, and she wrote it down, and he looked at what she wrote. His own poor honest figure entered in her clean hand beside 40 years of her father's, and something moved in his face that she had not seen there before, a kind of humility that sat strangely and well on a proud man. He said that he had spent his life having the world measured for him by men who told him what he wished to hear, and that he had not known, until a plain woman refused to do it, how much he had hungered to be told instead what was so. She answered that the ground would tell him what was so, if he would learn to read it, and that it asked nothing of a man but patience and honesty, which were commoner virtues than the world pretended, and rarer in the practice than it liked to think. He was quiet at that, watching her, and then he said, in the plain way he had learned from her, that he did not think he had ever respected a person as he respected her, and that he had come to suspect the respect was not the whole of what he felt, and that he was too lately humbled to court a woman by any means but the truth, and so he would tell her the truth and leave her to measure it. And Honora, who had been measured against her whole life, and found wanting by people not fit to hold her chain, stood on the high ground in the gold light, and let herself, for once, be seen entire, and found that being truly seen by the right eyes was worth every year she had spent invisible to the wrong ones. She did not become a duchess in a week. This is not that kind of story, and she was not that kind of woman, and he was not that kind of man. What grew between them grew the way her surveys grew, slowly, honestly, station by station, each new understanding keyed to the last so that no part of it could be moved without breaking the rest, until it stood as anchored and unarguable as a boundary set in stone at both ends. But that first true thing, the respect, the dawning astonished respect of a proud man for a quiet woman who had turned out to have measured everything, was the foundation of it all, and Honora, who knew the value of a good foundation better than anyone alive, was content to build slowly upon it, and let the rest come true in its own time. In the years after, when the common of Ashfield ran open and fair, and the tenants kept their rights secure in writing at last, Honora Fenwick still went out sometimes, in the gold of the evening, to the grey mere stone at the ford, and laid her hand on the old estate mark worn almost smooth, and stood a while with the field book under her arm, Her father had told her that a line drawn true was a small piece of justice made solid, and she had believed him, and she believed it still, more surely than ever. The stones had waited in the dark through all of it, patient and unbreathable, keeping the truth safe until someone had the eyes to read them, and the nerve to dig, and a chain, she thought, laying her hand on the stone in the last of the light, has 100 links, and not one of them lies, and neither, in the end, does the ground, if only there is one quiet soul left who has troubled to measure it and set it down, and one great one, at last, with the humility to look.